Okay, we're live.
We are live. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special meeting of Mahone Bay Town Council. We have the entire council here today and some staff. And people at home are joining us on YouTube.
Joe gave regrets.
Joe gave us Joe's not here. Joe, he's not getting married, is he? He's going to a wedding. That's nice.
You can end up married.
We will try and survive without Joseph. And we have an agenda that was emailed to you, but we will begin by acknowledging that we are gathered again today in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, present, and future territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Today, we gather with the intent followed by the living peace and friendship treaties, and we do so with respect, cooperation, and coexistence. Council meeting is called to order. You do have an agenda that was emailed to you. What is your wish?
I move the approval.
Seconded, Councillor Carver, you heard the motion. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. I would note that we do have two items on the agenda, and then we have a closed session that deals with contract negotiations under the Municipal Government Act, Section 22(2)E. So with that, let's go to the Housing Accelerator Fund application. CAO.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So we had an introductory staff report. Well, I guess the first one on this subject was 2 months ago, where we found out about the Housing Accelerator Fund and its impending deadline, and we recommended to council that staff be tasked to put together an application. And then the regular meeting on July 27th, council was presented with a fairly robust report put together by our deputy CAO, Eric, essentially summarizing how we were approaching the application. There's not, most of the application criteria is a little bit different from a standard program. So the budget is derived from the targets for housing, which in turn, inform the initiatives that are eligible under those targets. So it's something that I think the most effective way to walk through with council is actually to walk you through the application form. We looked at ways to export it, but the way they've set it up in HTML it's very, very difficult to export the information in any meaningful way. So I think my sharing the screen and actually walking through the application as it's constructed on the CMHC website is probably the best thing to do. We'll emphasize how the program is designed and how that results in the application draft we put together. And then also more specifically getting into how that ties into the timeline and actual steps that would be taken in the case that this approval for funding was received. So I think without further ado, if there aren't any off the top questions, I think it makes sense for me to walk through the application, and then the thought is we'd have a good opportunity for questions through that walk.
One quick question. I've never thought of this before. When you share your screen, do the people at home see what's on your screen as well?
Yeah, if I'm sharing it through the Zoom, then it's
okay.
Yeah. All right, and just to keep in mind, the recommendation today would be the council approve the direct staff to submit an application. The deadline is next Friday.
Okay.
So I'm just going to start with the portal on the website. And hopefully this will help explain why we decided to do it this way. Okay, so I just thought, to walk through, I should start at the beginning. So there's contact information and information about the town as a municipality, et cetera. So then the project details part. Oh,
Are you able to make it bigger?
That's what I was just.
Yeah, I know I am. Sorry, one sec. Gonna move the Zoom stuff out of the way.
Because I don't think I can make it bigger on.
Yeah.
There it is.
That's better.
That's probably gonna fit,
Okay.
okay, I think all of them are framed about the same on the page, so
Yeah.
if I skip to the next one and everything's off center, I'll fix it again. So just very briefly, this is the CMHC portal. Sorry, Richard, was the other question?
No, just not getting it there. Okay, so
Yeah, you gotta either watch the Zoom on your screen or you can see it up there, although it's a little bit smaller. Okay, so this part is really just, you know, boilerplate detail at the beginning. You have to choose your application stream. We're a municipality, or we're in the small stream, so basically the small stream here is above or below 10,000 population in a municipality. So that puts us in the small rural category. Our proponent type is municipal. I'm not going to pop each of these out. There's not much to them. Municipality type is clarifying between, in this case, local government or regional district. Those are the two options. And the local government court. And then the housing needs assessment is just a yes, no, do you have one? And then you have to attach it later on in the application. So that's very high level, very, you know, introductory stuff. The next part of the application format here is with respect to scoring. And so it's, you know, this is all informed by a spreadsheet that is later on in the application here. It's just talking about, you know, would our application score well based on these top level criteria around the targets that are being set, how they relate to annual housing supply projections and the needs assessment, and whether there is a needs assessment. And essentially this says our score of, you know, 15 on this page. I think Eric, more familiar with the scoring than me, that is the maximum amount that you can get on this page.
it
Right?
is, yeah.
Okay. So I'm not
And what's
gonna go
that based on?
So it's each of these things is, you know, what is the annual supply rate? What is the annual growth percentage change? These are based on what we purport to do, like what the program application says. These are our targets. And if our targets were less ambitious, I get that would score lower, Eric, is that?
Yeah, I mean, most of the scoring throughout the application is sort of a small, medium, large setup. So like if your target is low, you get 1, if it's medium, you get 3, and if it's high or above their threshold, you get 5. And that's how they score things throughout the whole application.
So you'll see the scoring comes up a lot with respect to different initiatives, and some of the decisions that we made with the application, especially around timelines, speak to improving the scoring, because rather than them saying, you've got to do this, this, and this, they've really left a lot of discretion, but then the discretionary choices are the basis of your score, and, you know, we'll give you more or less chance of getting approved. So maximizing chance of approved often means, you know, going with what they would like to see in each case, and they've been quite clear. They want to see it done quicker, they want to see better results. So, you know, the more you can promise in the shortest time, that's where the score is higher. The question really becomes, is that something we actually think is achievable if we've got this?
So my question, is it achievable?
Yeah, and that's where we're really looking today for that guidance. When you've seen everything, is like, is this too ambitious or not ambitious enough? Although I don't think that will be the case. Okay, so this again, it's pretty straightforward, just around the needs assessment and what are your targets. And then this is the section that actually is fleshed out. This is where most of the scoring comes in. This is where most of the detail, timelines and everything come in. And it basically requires you to have 5 initiatives. If you're in the small rural stream, you have to have 5 initiatives. If you're in the large urban stream, you have to have 7 initiatives. This is what this whole application is what they refer to as your action plan. There's no separate document. It is the application. But really, it's this section, this particular group of initiatives. And they said if you have more than 5, they're only going to count 5. So you really only get 5. And we've made sure that everything fits together under these broader headings. And, you know, some of them are more expansive than others, and we'll get into that here. But I think it actually makes sense before going into the initiatives in depth, because they're also heavily informed by the assessment calculation of targets and how that relates to the budget, that we should go on to the spreadsheet that is on the next section. Rather than going on to it here in this, it has to be an attachment. They prescribe the attachment. So I'm just going to open the attachment here and switch what I'm sharing on screen to Excel for one moment.
So in terms of process, do you want us to wait? with
No, if you have
or-
questions, you can jump in now, yeah.
I think I still am concerned with the title of the first initiative, when we call it asset management.
Okay, well, if you have a question about the initiatives, let's come
Yeah,
back in one
yeah,
sec, yeah,
yeah.
because I'm gonna do this one first. I think it is really better to get questions on this one before we come to the initiatives. So this should take it to Excel. Yes. Okay, so this is actually a really brief form, but it just it creates a lot of the underlying assumptions reflected in the issues. So just asking, basic qualifying questions. Our status confirming that we're eligible to make this application. Has council approved it? Well, yeah, we're gonna assume yes, or we won't be submitting it. So that's today's discussion. And then in the action plan, so the total number of housing units projected to be created without support from HAF. So this is based on needs assessment information from.
It's a combination of
Problems, okay.
assessment information and information from our own planners.
So the 18 is, okay. So that 18 that we would project without any support from the housing, from this particular program, the Housing Accelerator Fund, would be, as you can see here, 12 single attached homes and 6 multi-unit housing other. Obviously, we're not, this is a projection. This is based on available information and trends over prior years. It doesn't necessarily take into account, the particular buildings that would be built. So it's when you say 6 multi-unit, like obviously that's, if there's a building built, that is going to dictate how many there are. It could come in the sudden growth of, well, a building with 20 units gets built and hey, there you go, there's 20 units all at once, and then there might be no unit for another 5 years.
So that 6 is the units in the building, not the buildings.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
so it's just 18 units in total over the next 3 years, and that's without doing anything on the part of the town, projected growth. I just want to stress, we didn't like say there was a 6-unit building that was specifically in mind there. That's not what that represents. And it's only based on historic trends. So the fact that the province is, sort of turning into a more rapid growth phase at the moment, or appears to be, and other local factors like the twinning of the highways and remote work and all this kind of stuff that is leading the growth in Mahone Bay is not fully captured in there. Like that's, it's an assumption based on available.
So I hear there is a multi-unit building being proposed right now.
Well, there's quite a number potentially.
Yeah, well, the land behind what was Bill's store,
Hmm.
that's been sold. And I heard from the other day, he said you guys kind of putting it farm looking.
Well, that would be good, certainly for these targets. So what we've done is basically said, if there were 18 without any effort, specifically intervention, then what's the total number projected with the support of this program? And so what we're proposing here is to set that at 100. And that is based obviously on, a lot of assumptions. But as we just heard from Councillor Now, there are places in town now that with fairly minimal intervention have significant potential to meet this target of 100 units over the next 3 years. And there's other places that we've been exploring through our Plan Mahone Bay process that have potential to take that even further if there are, appropriate service extensions and support in the land use bylaw process. So the 100 we need to do a projection where it breaks it down by different types of buildings. Again, this kind of comes up in how the funding is calculated in a minute. That's the purpose of the spreadsheet. But we've again said, based on our understanding of how we would be able to move the needle with construction, it's likely that the bigger increases as a result of any intervention through this program would be on the multi-unit side. Now, that's not to say that this wouldn't potentially support more density of single homes. There are strategies and initiatives included here that are certainly intended to encourage that type of housing growth as well. But, the projects that the town can influence most directly and that will result in the biggest, bang for the buck in terms of housing creation are multi-unit, and also in terms of affordability goals. Typically, that's where that would be more easily addressed. So we said we're looking at 15 single detached homes, 50 multi-unit missing middle homes, and then 35 other. Councilor Carter.
The missing middle, can you just refresh our memory about what that is referring to?
Over there.
Missing middles are essentially low-rise apartment buildings, so generally not more than 4 floors. They may include duplexes, triplexes. So things that are along the waterfront as you drive into town, those would be considered missing middle.
Why are they called missing middle?
Because that's just the words that they
Well,
use to describe them. I think that they are actually a type of housing. I was unfamiliar with it, so.
It really speaks more to larger cities. So there's
Yeah.
criticism in Canada. Calgary is always held up as the worst example of this probably in the world. Of you have high rises and then you have single family homes and you have nothing in between.
Oh.
Whereas in our case, like missing middle is the big stuff. So we don't go bigger than that anyway, right? So it's just a term that classifies that middle scale housing. development.
So the apartments across from me would be considered missing middle? the
Yeah,
60?
I would think so. Yeah, because I mean, in a city, that's a small, low-rise apartment building.
And then the multi-unit housing other would be,
Potentially high rises or maybe more dormitory style, so you're renting a room or a series.
But
not
supportive
necessarily
housing might
supportive
do.
housing.
There's a good graphic in that other report that
Mhm.
helps to expand.
Yes, yeah, in the report to the meeting on the 27th. All right, so breakdown for the programs, year by year breakdown is also required. So you say, okay, here's the 100 broken down and what type of housing stock it might be. Here's the 100 broken down into what year it might be achievable. And obviously, if we're going to weight it more towards the end of the 3-year period because it takes time for programs to pay off.
No, this is permitted.
Yes,
Not-
yeah, so
not
that is a
necessarily
distinction. They don't have to be completed. They have to be permitted. And actually, a lot of the things in the application ask for 5 and 10-year expectations. So it's one of the peculiarities of this program, and Eric's talked a bit about it, where they're acknowledging that results don't happen overnight, but they're also trying to present as much upfront benefit to this as they can and, weight it accordingly. So, yeah, they don't want you to say everything will happen in 10 years, don't expect anything in the first 3, because then you'll probably score quite badly and they won't give you any funding. But the realization is that it will take time to build housing.
is that the only penalty if you don't meet the marker?
Well, that's something we can get into now. We might as well get into now. So the way that this funding is actually awarded, and Eric, you can jump in on this one, but they initially assess how much you would be eligible for based on your target, but they also have an annual check-in on that, and based on your results in terms of doing the things you said you would do and creating the units you expected to create, they do have the ability to cut you off basically, or change the amount that you're being granted. And the expectation is probably they're going to confirm more upfront than they end up flowing, because some units will not carry out the things or achieve the results that they've stated. And it is difficult to operate in that environment. I think this is an experiment on their part, but I think it's also part of how we have to approach this. Is, you'll see as we go through the initiatives, they're not all like a normal application for external funding. If we're talking about money for infrastructure or something, we're going to say this is the infrastructure, we're going to go get it costed, and we're going to say this is what we need. And that is not how this works. And really we'll have to do what we can do with the money that we have. And each step of the process and each of the initiatives sort of builds towards that. So the first step is, in each case, is planning, building capacity, then executing things. And as we, move through those steps, we're going to have to right size it and follow available opportunities, and then realize that this is not the only source of funding that will support some of these initiatives as well. That this is one tool, and hopefully it will provide, as you'll see when we get to initiatives, that initial capacity and planning stuff. And then whether it comes through to say, well, you did all that so well, and now we're funding the actual construction of things, that is something they reserve the right to say. If you just come looking for money for a project you've already got figured out, and it's already gonna happen, that's not really what we're looking for in this case, which is funny, because that's literally all that everybody has traditionally ever
Ever
been
done.
looking for in terms of shovel-ready projects, but, you know, this is a new approach, and I think it is intended to try to separate what was gonna happen anyway from the potential strategic leveraging of this federal money.
So is this money more or less intended to increase the infrastructure to support this?
Well, yeah, we'll get into the breakdown. The vast majority of what we would do with the money we'd be eligible for would be that. But that's certainly not the first step, and when you look at how they evaluate it, like, just saying you're gonna do that when you wouldn't get anything, I don't think.
Okay,
I think the overall intention of the program is not to sort of to change how things have always been done. I mean, there's historically local governments and all other levels of government have identified very finite things that they want to make a change with hopes of an impact. But here, I think the gauge of this program is to sort of zoom out, look at things in a broader scope, do some more longer term planning rather than a one-off project, in hopes that over time we sort of change how we focus on housing and how we look at housing to hopefully increase the stock, instead of saying, for instance, all right, this street needs upgrades to this infrastructure. It's like, well, let's look at the infrastructure of the whole town, prioritize, plan, and be more strategic about it on a broader scope is my impression.
Councillor Holmes Crowe.
I have a concern about when you get to the construction time. And where's the labor going to come from? You're going to have every municipality applying for these grants. Everybody, we see what's going on in Bridgewater, their plan. We know what Modal's doing. Those are, very big construction projects. Where is the labor force going to come from? I know people can't get a deck built or, do renovations in their homes right now. Where are we going? And laborers are going to head to the city or the bigger centers because the pay's better.
So, I mean, I think those are all reasonable questions. I don't think that this program is as bad in that way of sending everybody to the same contractors at the same time as most federal programs have historically been, because almost all of the previous programs were like, you've got to do only wastewater distribution, treatment, or whatever, and you've got to do it by the end of this year. And so everybody goes to market at the exact same time, and it's a real challenge. What you're describing, I think, is a general condition that is the condition of the market that we're going to be dealing with as through this program, but I doubt that this money alone will substantially influence the availability of contractors. That's just going to be part of the challenge of doing anything in housing at the current moment, and the industry is, going to grow to keep up to the extent that they can, but it will usually lag. And, I think we should also remember, as Councilor Wilson pointed out, this is about permits. So it's not necessarily about construction being completed on projects. So there's going to be a number of factors influencing private and nonprofit developers, from availability of funds and interest rates, borrowing, to availability of contractors and market prices for things, delays on certain supply elements that they need. And, we're not, as you'll see through the initiatives, intending to really wade into the middle of that. So essentially the purpose here of the 100-unit goal, and then you say, well, if there were going to be so many anyway, how many would be the net result? It's 82. And then that's what you get to calculate that it's more than 5%. These are the things that led to that first page on the application form scoring high in terms of the goal. So we could reduce this goal and still score maximum points on that front. And I don't know, Eric, I don't think we specifically looked at what's the minimum goal we could have to score the maximum points, but I think we could probably knock it down a little bit and still do that.
Yeah, I think the minimum score for the maximum points on the average annual housing supply, the 1.1, I think that it was 2.5. And then
We could have half of this target. We could be targeting maybe 60 units, which would be,
Absolutely. I mean, our
the
target-
net growth would be, so you'll see why we would not say to just say 60, because you think, well, if you're going to score maximum, then, but what it actually influences that number, and that's the next, what I'm going down to here on this spreadsheet, is the amount of money.
Right.
So if we said we could score as highly with 60 as with 100, then we could lower the number, and it would lower the corresponding eligibility for funding. So that's a choice we can make here.
I mean, quite significantly, because the current goal in this spreadsheet is 60% of our goal will be affordable. An additional top-up funding of, I think, $19,000 per unit, so that would cut it down, so if.
So I was gonna say that's probably the biggest question for us is like, is 60 out of the 100 to be, is that an overshot for in terms of affordability? But I wanted to point out the definition here. So there's a definition of, and we'll take a question just one second. The definition of affordability here is 30% of median household income. Median household income in Mahone Bay was $62,000 in the last census. So that's just over $1,500 monthly on housing. So in terms of like, you know, we asked the public when we went out on this, and there was a mixture of opinion, as Eric presented on 27th. There are people who would say that 1,500 is a, you know, a reasonable level, and there are people who would say that that, you know, really represents an impossible level of rent. And I think, you know, when we talk about affordability, there's always been this emphasis on non-market affordability. And so if we said like, we'll create less affordable targets that are, or less affordable units that are much more affordable than this, but the 60 is a 60 affordable meeting that definition. So, you know, of that, there might be 50 that are $1,500 a month. And then there might be 10 that are $600 a month. And I'm just making up numbers, but I'm pointing out that it doesn't mean 60 units meeting a non-market definition of affordability. And anyway, if there are any questions about that, and then we'll show how the calculation of money is broken down.
So basically, if we don't reach the 100 permits by the time this is up, then we just lose some of the funding. Is that the point behind it?
Yeah, but they're not going to wait till the end of 3 years. They're going to check in every year to see how we're doing on implementing the actions, and then also how we're doing on the associated creation of units. And they do peg that to each initiative. Each initiative has to say, here's how many units this particular aspect of what we're doing would be expected to, and the aspects are very intertwined. So that's a difficult process. Obviously, can't totally separate them that way. And I'll go through all that.
So by end of year one, what might we need to show that we've accomplished? For example, on this initiative.
So what we need to show speaks to the initiatives themselves, and each one has some milestones, and we have to show that we've completed those milestones. And then there is an associated growth in housing, permitted housing units. Whether that in the first year is a binary, I think there'll be more, my take on it, this is a new program, is that they'll be more interested in the accomplishment of milestones in year one than in the creation of permitted units in year one.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you are all talk and no action, you know, they're looking to see both things, so.
So are the milestones itemized later?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Derek, do you want to?
No, I was just gonna say, in conversations I've had, I mean, the federal goal is 100,000 new permitted units over the next 3 years across the country. And in the things I've been in, CMHC has assured and reassured that this is a collaborative effort. So if there are instances where our initiative is not one that's approved by them, they said that they would work with municipal units to try to flesh things out. So though there are milestones and goalposts and things like that, the messaging has been that this is going to be, that these projects will also be helped and supported in a sense from CMHC and the feds. So not to go forward in sort of a daunting thought that if we don't reach the 10 and we haven't hit the milestones exactly, that we're going to be totally cut off. It's unclear what that would look like. I would expect there might be adjustments to your award, like if you've gotten 20% of what you've said you're going to do in year one, then they might be like, well, you're only going to get 20% of the funding in year two, or have an adjustment or some conversations about how to reach those goals. That part has been
Great.
yeah, thanks.
They really needed that. On the program,
Yeah.
because most federal programs, like you could barely get someone to answer the phone. Good luck if they have any ability to recall, pull up a file, talk to anything about your application. They just want the money out the door.
Right.
So this is a really different approach where they actually emphasize that they will have people who will build a relationship with with the recipients. Like that's not a typical federal program, but to be fair, this is CMHC. This is not directly the federal government where we've got money for infrastructure previously.
Councillor Wilson and the deputy mayor.
I'll go first. Great. Just a couple of comments. One is, I'm quite comfortable with 100, although my gut says it should be an uneven number. And my sense is, and I have no idea why I feel this way, but that the single unit housing probably should be a bigger number than 10. Just based on what we know about what's going on in town right now.
15, but it's still.
Or 15, yeah, sorry, 15. The other thing, the only other comment I would make in regard, without getting into the twos and fro's about what's affordable and what isn't, is we should try, I think, and make sure that these numbers align so that at the end of the 3-year period, we have achieved our 25% total affordable housing goal that's in the strategic plan.
And that was a large part of why Eric had proposed such an ambitious affordability percentage, because our own strategic plan really would require that level of ambition, I think. So
Is
that's
it 60.
Yeah, I think it would. Now, I think we have to run that calculation in the background, and we should do, because I'm not sure that we definitively have done, because we always lack a picture of existing affordable housing units, and that was kind of part of what the housing strategy would help to define, is because that was based on what is the composition of the total housing stock in the community, which means we need to know currently what would meet that definition. And I think that's a little gray, but that's one of the initiatives actually included.
And to your point, Councillor Wilson, these numbers come with the assumption that there would be sort of an active effort to encourage the missing middle development in a sense, and not necessarily discourage the single detached, but have initiatives in place to encourage a change in the type of development that has historically happened. So another.
They do value specifically the creation of the
Yeah.
density with the multi-unit.
That's right.
Deputy mayor.
Yeah, so just to answer your question around oddness, I agree, maybe make it 101. The concern that I probably will throw out there is around the definition of affordable housing. So what is affordable? I think going by median might be a concern for me. Maybe we might, and I think I did see that there might be a step for us to actually define it. The question for me is, if we're going to define it from Mahone Bay with the funds that we get or the process that we put in place, how are we in the application, how are we defining it? And I would say market-based measures would be much more, I guess, a better way to look at it rather than a median income, because our median income is way high compared to minimum wage, for example.
So, yeah, I mean, this is a discussion going on at the provincial level. There was just an article, I think, in the paper just now, or on CBC just now, about how the province has had to move their level from 30 to 50% in terms of funding. And you know, that was taking into consideration that the actual average rent, because these are rent subsidy programs that they're talking about, and this is not just rent, this is housing affordability even if you own the home, but the housing rent was being looked at as like, what is the average housing rent in the HRM? What I don't know that we necessarily have access to that level of statistic at the level of Mahone Bay. We are a census division, so we get like federal census information broken down at level of Mahone Bay, but I don't believe, I'll have to double check, that average rent is done at the level of Mahone Bay. So if we use that as part of a consideration, you probably have to go up to a higher level, like use like the province level, for example, or possibly Lunenburg County. Yeah, I'm just
I think we should have
yeah.
something.
Yeah, and then whether that is just rent versus, so I guess the thing would be, and Eric, maybe you can chime in on this, but like the 30% median income definition is pretty standardized in the sense that like, while one of the initiatives certainly speaks, as was referenced previously, to digging into and refining that and, you know, better understanding inclusivity and all this kind of stuff is certainly fleshed out within the initiatives. But in terms of qualifying for the targets that are, like the funding that is laid out here, the funding eligibility, like 30% of median income in the local jurisdiction is a sort of a standard.
Yeah, I just pulled up the CMHC definition of affordable housing, and it says in Canada, housing is considered affordable if it costs less than 30% of a household's before tax income. So the definition that's in this council strategic plan is in line with most definitions around the country, and CMHC's definition here itself. It's just a matter of is that out of date, or is it accurate, or it's up to the council to decide what sort of definition of affordability they want and going forward, because to your point, yes, the median income may be higher here than in other places, but that is a standard definition. I think the whole point of that is to make affordability contextual to where you are and the population of the place. There's a lot of caveats to that definition everywhere.
So what we're recommending is that it would be used for the purposes of the application calculation of eligibility, and then for reporting purposes, it forms sort of a high threshold. I think I would think the consensus is probably that affordability will be equal to or less than that we're like, if we said that this was the definition of affordability at approximately $1,500 a month, and then we were to say that later we wanted to do better than that, and as I mentioned, there's certainly different arguments for that. That wouldn't compromise our meeting the targets that we had laid out to the program. Like we'd have set a lesser target for them, which if they accept, we can always exceed. And when we get into the initiatives, like we'll look at how, like, certainly there's an expectation that some of the units that would be created would do better than that definition, like I mentioned earlier. So if we set a higher definition here, I guess it's just to say, then that's the target that we're holding as our minimum standard in terms of affordability.
So what I'll point out is that definition is wrong if we use median income. If we use median income, the definition is wrong. If we use market-based measures, whereby you're looking at the cost of goods and services, then the definition holds. I don't know if that makes sense. The 30% threshold still stands, but 30% compared to what? To a certain extent, that's what I'm saying. If we use median income for our population, then we're basically taking a situation whereby there's quite a large number of folks who actually earn quite a lot, and there's a number of folks who earn very, very little. So median doesn't really work for us in that particular case. We might need to look at it differently. And what I was trying to say is, as we define it now, we will work on it when you're doing a strategy and a plan for the town. That definition will change. I would rather we did not put too high of a definition of a number now and actually think about a number that. So right now, when we say 1,500 in this public context, somebody goes and looks at it from a town perspective as a resident and say, well, these guys are talking about affordable housing of 1,500. That's not really affordable housing in the context of what people are living it right now. So we come across as folks who actually do not know or cannot figure out what reality is. So there's a caution for me there around just that number. We really need to look at it a little bit more. It's not a big issue. There might be points where I think actually SHAC might be able to help with that and figure out exactly, because I think a few years ago, there were some numbers about what put out by SHAC as to what would be affordable for all municipal units. I can't remember it offhand right now, but I think it's there, and it's not 1,500.
I think I included those links in my response to the request for council to provide input. And I find the concept difficult. It has to do with the job the wage that can support a rent, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And in many ways, CMHC has that definition, but I guess contextually, locally, we can challenge that definition in many ways, in the sense that statistics don't necessarily give you the entire picture. You can have a very skewed distribution of income in a particular community, which means if you take what the stats tell you, there's, from an equity perspective, there's quite a large group of folks who are ignored because they're not, I guess, statistically significant.
Looks like it's perpetuating the status quo.
Exactly. Yeah.
And certainly when you get into these initiatives, like that's all stuff that staff has an expectation that would be part of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a question of where do you start that initial bar? I was able to determine that we do have median and average shelter costs for owned and rented dwellings at the Mahone Bay level. So for the census, so we've got 11,000 or 1,100, basically $1,110 a month is the median and average. So I don't make any distinction there. Rented, and then there's a huge distinction in terms of median and average owned from 930 to 1216. So there's a pretty big difference between. So all of those are below the level that we described based on income. So yeah, it's definitely thought provoking and something that needs to be addressed in the course of the application. But you know, I guess again, I think for the purpose of the application, setting ourselves a more aggressive standard there is only going, I think, to reduce the number of units that we would probably describe as being achievable, or call into significant question whether we can achieve the results that we're describing. So if council's will were to set a more aggressive goal here, it's possible that would help to increase the scoring in some general way, that they would see that and they would think, well, this council's really serious about this. But I think it's also equally possible that it will seem unrealistic.
Well, can I do?
Yes, Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, just in terms of the realism of this, I think it's fair to say that if we could wave a magic wand and put together an appropriate mix of housing and do 25 units a year built and ready to go in the next 5 years, they'd all be sold. Because the demand is such to get into Mahone Bay that I don't think, like, assuming infrastructure and all those things are in place, that those are imminently doable things. The question is, to my mind, the question is, do we want to direct, in addition to the federal money that's flowing, there's a significant resource issue that we have to come to grips with in terms of managing this whole process. This is not something that you can do, in an hour and a half on Tuesday afternoon.
And mostly the initiatives that when we get into them, they speak to capacity building in those areas. So is everyone comfortable with just moving on for now, and then we can circle back if there are any actual things?
I'll fight with Francis later.
So just to move on to that, what I just think about that the whole fund talks about housing accelerator fund. It's to accelerate housing development. It's not to actually, from my perspective, do the housing development. What you're trying to do is ensure that you're giving a push to what can happen. And as you give that push, all these other factors will come into play that will, from my perspective, allow us to get to that level of infrastructure growth. And then the way I can think of it and maybe simplify it is, you remember when we started having conversations about the soccer field, we were like, well, there are no numbers in terms of views, but now there's quite a high number of views because it's been improved. There are other factors that came into play that has allowed that use to happen. And so this will give us that injection we need as a town. And hopefully from there, we might count on the other levels of government or developers who might have an interest to say, well, maybe we can partner with you. I have this piece of land here and there are things that I can do with it just to get infrastructure to my place. Thinking about the above units construction, that might not have been envisioned, but there was a significant investment on his part to be able to get it to where it happened. So things like that can be spurred on by.
Yeah, and as you'll see when we get into this, that the tools are sort of included in here to do that, if we get the funding.
Yeah.
So this part is about the calculation of funding, so it's just everything we just went through, 82 net new units, how those would be reflected, what percentage are affordable, and then that determines this calculation for how much money. So as Eric said, it's basically a base funding of $20,000 per unit for the net new units. That results in the 1.64 million. And then top up funding having to do with the type of units. So again, missing middle is prioritized because it's something that Canadian cities need now. Why it's prioritized in the rural small category, well, who knows? But anyway, we're going to benefit from that in terms of the amount of money. That's 600,000. We don't have any places accessing rapid transit. That was another thing that was a focus for them, is they want their new housing units, affordable housing units, to be located next to rapid transit. Well, obviously that's not an option here. And then that results in another 803,000. And then the affordable unit calculation is, as Eric mentioned, 19,000 per unit for the 60 units. It's another 1,140. So that's what brings us down to the total of 3,583,000, and the total funding per unit then of 43. And so that's really what, we can then take and budget out in terms of initiatives. Like, how would we use this? It's a very unusual way to do this. Normally you say, what do we need? And then you ask for that. This is, how would you use up to this amount to help those 82 units get built? And so that's where the initiatives come in. It's basically saying, okay, so we're allowed to plan to use this money to achieve these results. How would we do it? And that's where the initiatives lay all that out. So I'll go back to the web portal to walk through that part, and just if anyone has any questions here. Oh, and then just very quickly, the last little detail on here on the first sheet of this is just so it does ask here about capital projects. Again, this will be more fleshed out in the initiatives part, but if they want to know what capital projects could be connected to this. So broadly speaking, it's expansion of water, wastewater, electrical utility infrastructure to support housing development, expansion or creation of transportation infrastructure, including streets, public parking areas, et cetera, serving new housing development, repair and expansion of sidewalks, walkways, and other active transportation infrastructure, bike paths, lanes, accessible trails, pedestrian bridges, et cetera, serving new housing developments to meet accessibility standards, and expansion of green space, recreational amenities, serving new housing development. So these are, and renovation of existing buildings, construction of new buildings for affordable housing with local nonprofit support. So these are the types of capital projects that we would see being associated with the implementation of the initiatives that will be described on the other portal, but they require you to list them broadly here.
Councillor Turner?
So just the mention of streets there made me think of the public streets versus private streets discussion, and whether, if we do decide to permit the private streets, and then it would any work that the town does on the private street or facilitating with that.
So I think,
Eligible
based on the conversations we've had, more likely what this would be for is that we would work with a housing developer and say, if the town were to extend the street with services, then you would build the housing.
Right,
that kind
okay.
of thing. And in that situation, this program would support the town undertaking the cost of building the street and extending the services. And that would be seen as creating the units that get built on the street.
Councillor Wilson?
This just popped into my brain. But taking, for example, what the current public works land is across from the tennis court. Let's assume that we put that up for sale, and let's assume somebody wanted to build a 40-unit apartment block on that property. How would we augment, or how would we facilitate that construction through this program? Or could, because the services are all there, the roads are there. You can't do a straight subsidy, I assume.
So both types of things would be possible depending on the scenario. So in the case of upgrading existing infrastructure, there are things that would be needed. The wastewater serving that property would need work. Water extension. I think electrical is probably going to be fine. And then access, obviously, the sidewalks end prior to that, so it might be a discussion of adding a crosswalk and then adding a sidewalk on Hawthorne. So there are things that could certainly relate to that. Even part of that property becoming green space associated with the development, if there's like a playground or something. So those are all things that could be, but also we can contribute directly to construction if the construction is being done by a nonprofit entity. And so if that were the case there, then the town could potentially be involved in that too. And all of those types of things are more fleshed out in the initiatives. This just required us to say, what are the types of capital projects? Because you're talking about $3.5 million. I mean, you're not gonna use all that on planning and staff capacity. So obviously there's capital projects there. And then they want to know, because they're very skeptical about it. If a municipality, especially a regional district, like, what do you know? What is your control over all of the infrastructure? Right? Like, if you say we're going to make this happen, is that just a bunch of, cajoling and incentivizing and provoking and asking, or can you actually make it happen? So we need to emphasize that we are a full service town. We have the capacity to do all of these things, all of the types of infrastructure involved. We're the ones in charge. So I just described it. Town of Mahone Bay is responsible for water, wastewater, electrical, and transportation services within its boundaries. With all services governed by the town council, we're therefore able to closely align land use planning and housing strategies with local infrastructure plans. So we're the only jurisdiction. We even have electrical. Like, that's an advantage to us. If we say we're going to do something, there's no other entities involved in stopping us from doing something. And even fire services are ours, which maybe I should add to this. Like, those are the typical impediments to carrying out these type of programs. We're responsible for all of them. And the council, as Joe would point out if he was here, governs all of them. We don't even have separate commissions or anything. It's literally you folks in the room. If you say make it happen, you're the only jurisdiction involved, with the exception of maybe environmental permitting and stuff like that.
But we're talking about maybe selling land, but not giving away land like we did to Habitat for Humanity. And
Well, both things could be contained within the strategy. Well, that'll be probably something to dig into with the initiatives a little further, because there's a lot of different ways that housing can be facilitated, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There's some pros and cons to both ways.
yeah,
And I'll probably say, probably that's not conversation for it.
We don't have to go all sorted today.
Yeah, we don't have to solve that today. This is to create the environment for us to have a good conversation when that conversation needs to be had. And I don't think we need to solve whether we're giving somebody or we're selling the land today, from my perspective. One of the questions, I hope it doesn't digress us a little bit. In thinking about infrastructure and thinking about the growth of our utilities as a major piece, we talked about in the past about consulting with Model, and I was wondering whether there has been any conversation as to whether they are putting in an application into this fund and whether there could be ties around. So when I think about sort of wastewater extension towards maybe school, for example, or towards Blockhouse, for example, are those things that Model might want to put in?
Yeah, it's certainly, like, we've had conversations with Modal about those extensions and their plans, and we've done it within the context of their development of their 2040 strategy. So in terms of whether they're applying for this specific program, we haven't had that conversation, but they have expressed an interest in some opportunities, and particularly because we're doing projects in certain areas, if and when we're doing a project for an extension, they would want the option to look at possibly furthering that. And so right now we have one, which is the Main Street upgrades. And they have indicated that once that is out for engineering, by the time we have a contractor on it in September, that they would be interested in requesting a change order to have the engineer do the work associated with scoping an upgrade to serve Blockhouse, if that was something that, they pay for the engineer's additional work. So we'd scope it as a change order, and if they want to pay for the engineer to include that in their work, and then at the end of the day, if they like it or don't like it, it could be included in the scope of construction when we go to construction. So if this, I guess that's a long way to say, if this does come to saying we'll do a service extension as part of a housing support program, then the possibility of extending into MODL in a neighboring area could be considered. But it hasn't been, we haven't pre-considered it here. And really, we're not prescribing, like, staff have a lot of ideas about where strategic infrastructure expansions could happen to facilitate housing. And we know that we're working towards that through the land use planning process as well, in terms of identifying prospective areas. But we haven't gone anywhere in the initiatives to say, this is the street, or, this is but But really, a lot of the engineering and preliminary engineering work would be funded through this program. So essentially, I could say, here's what I would choose to target top 3, expansions. And then we could take those for engineering and costing and do all the preliminary work in the first phase of this program. And then in that year, next year, we would know, and then we would actually be able to turn around to MODF and say, well, this is the one we're looking at. Do you want, is there an opportunity for collaboration? So if there's no more questions on this spreadsheet, I'm going to go back to the initiatives. But if everyone doesn't mind, I'm just going to run quickly to the washroom here. I think it's a good opportunity to do that between switching screens. Okay.
I'm always talking, so I can't just go when somebody else is talking.
Duly noted. So, Kangata and Wilson Construction,
Yes.
get my name that good.
Yeah. Start, I mean,
We're back.
Are we ready to go again?
Right. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to share the web portal again this time. Oh. Okay, here we go. Back in. So this is the 5 initiatives. So all of that sort of groundwork gives you the opportunity to create 5 initiatives that are worth $3.5 million. So that's what we did here. And each one is interesting format here on the website. So you got to put in an initiative name, start date, completion date, and estimated number of units, and then the score. This seems like, how would you even get to this information? There's a little pop out here. Hopefully this will not make me have to share a different screen. I think they'll come up within this. You don't have permission.
You don't have permission.
Excuse me. It's just logged me out, I think, because I was on the other thing for more than a half hour. So. Back in. Always, anytime, I understand why they do it in a web portal, but anytime you're in a web portal, then you're gonna get logged out, and logged in, and logged out, and logged in. All right. And every time you go in, you have to review your contact information. It's changed in the past 45 minutes. Okay. So much to do. Back in. Urgent details in. All right, finally back to the initiatives, and this time I should have permission to click on this. There we go. Okay, so each of the initiatives has these pop outs, and like everything's just, nice format when you're filling it in, but not so great when you're trying to display it. So for each initiative, there's a large description, and I'll just go through it broadly here for each of these. So essentially this initiative, this proposed called Asset Management Infrastructure Plan Development and Implementation, essentially is, we have collected a lot of data concerning our asset management, or concerning our assets. We have now all of the information that you could put at the disposal of a contractor and say, knowing our land use maps, knowing the zoning, which will all be, fully set in the new plans this fall, and knowing our existing infrastructure, where everything is, the condition of it, the age of it, what would need to be done in which areas to facilitate development. Like it's something I can say, I know, well, we're gonna need to extend electrical over here, we're gonna need to upgrade the wastewater here, sorry, I was wondering if that was something I was doing or something you were doing.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Like, I don't think I did. So essentially, this would take the data we have, take the strategic objectives we have, and align them in a way that isn't just in my head, using contractors, basically. And what it would be able to do is, this one has it's described as being a number of different initiative types. So just to mention here, this would include various things that they want to see from, these are their words, implementing measures to address or prevent floodplain or climate change rise, incorporating climate change adaptation in town's asset management plans, creating a process for disposal of town-owned assets for the development of affordable housing as a right. So that's property and building assets or town assets. So they're part of this understanding of leveraging town assets to support development, but they also come back under the partnering with nonprofit, like creating partnerships, which is a different initiative. So these are things they would want to see, but we would be able to roll them into this one initiative, which is the development of this housing supportive asset management plan. The goal of this plan would be to have long-term vision for strategic infrastructure development expansion supported by tangible steps to update current town infrastructure with the goal of increasing the housing stock for a growing population. And so the objectives, this would target review of current assets and infrastructure supporting development, asset mapping of developable lands and town assets that could be repurposed, engineering, design, supporting expansion of services and infrastructure, water, wastewater, electrical, transportation, strategic update, expansion of infrastructure to serve new housing developments, environmental assessments and remediation of environmental hazards to make town-owned land suitable for development, because again, land assets are assets in this case, review of town property and zoning to allow for more streamlined development of town land or sale of town land, emergency management planning in response to potential emergencies, fire and flooding. So that's kind of speaking to some of their objectives around, planning. And so how that would break down here in terms of, okay, so yes, I'll also add, plan B would allow the town to better manage its current infrastructure. With this plan, have to take a proactive approach to infrastructure development rather than a reactive one, expanding utility infrastructure to new areas of town. Big coastal towns playing a place in every role in emergency management. This is in terms of coastal adaptation and development in flooded areas. But it also help inform strategic plan initiatives to establish business and active infrastructure needs. There's a idea that this would create a number of units over 10 years and over the program period of 3 years. Basically, this one has the larger goals within the 10 years because a lot of the time you're doing an expansion for a specific project, and we can think of some that would potentially be like an anchor. So if we've got a housing development that's somewhere in the community and you are already expanding services to serve that development, the tangential benefit of that is opening up a lot of additional lands to easier development in the near and further term. So this one has kind of more projected payoff within the 10 years, because as you'll see when you think about the level of infrastructure investment involved, it will serve a particular development, but it will also potentially serve other developments in the future. Like these are larger scale improvements. And so down here we've got how the scoring works is, again, this is the same thing Eric was mentioning earlier. The longer it will take, the less score you get. The more that you do, the more score that you get. So doing a lot over a long time scores kind of medium, basically, is where we ended up with this initiative. Each of the initiatives is scored separately. It's my understanding that they're evaluating them all together. So this is the weakest initiative in that sense and the most money, because we're basically saying of all of the initiatives, the largest amount of money is going to take the longest time to have the maximum effect. And things that are programmatic and can happen more quickly, like the disincentives stuff we'll talk about in a minute, that is going to have a quicker effect because of changing the regime, the planning situation, the requirements, the regulations, incentivizing fees, the speed of processing applications, all those sort of things. You could do that and then it's done and then it benefits everyone going forward. Doing infrastructure improvements takes more time, but it has an even more definitive effect on creation of housing stock. Because as Councillor Wilson said, if there were developable properties available, they'd be being developed. I mean, that's, you know, home based in a growth mode. We don't have to provoke that. That would happen if it could happen. So significantly, we've got a breakdown of the milestones here. So essentially, as I mentioned, the way this is envisioned is that we would be contracting an outside entity to take all the information that we have from our plan home big process and all of our asset management data collection, having them create a plan. The timeline for this plan creation is longer because there's quite a bit of behind the scenes sort of preliminary engineering crunching of things, but it's also longer because it would overlap with another initiative, which is the housing strategy initiative. And so the idea is that this initiative would support that one. So we need to make sure that the timeline for the two initiatives is lined up so that while most of the groundwork on this one is done, when that one is taking place before this one is actually finished, the housing strategy is finished to ensure alignment between the two. So this one is said that it would take until the end of June. It's basically right up until, you know, this council, you know, for all intents and purposes, you know, you guys will have until next July, and then we're into the August break, and then September is the month before the election and nominations are happening. And so really we want any adoption of plans as a result of this program to be targeted not later than June of next year. And that's kind of our timeline in that sense. So that's also your timeline and your strategic plan. So we've tried to kind of match that up. So council adoptions for July and then plan implementation thereafter. And this all presumes that this would be overseen by a coordinator role, which is itself described in one of the other initiatives. So that's where there's so much back and forth, because this initiative basically says, you know, we're going to create a plan to improve infrastructure to support housing, but the goals will be linked to another initiative, which is the housing strategy, and the capacity to carry it out will be linked to another initiative, which involves the establishment of a term coordinator position. So you can't read these in isolation. But that being said, before I go on to the other ones, are there any questions about this one in isolation? Or should I'll go through all of them and you can ask it. Oh, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned this when we started around just the name of the initiative. I strongly urge us to remove asset management and focus on improving infrastructure in that. And maybe this is a reaction to having been on asset management committee. When I see asset management, for me, that's very passive. Doesn't feel or doesn't come across for me as an aggressive move towards strategically improving infrastructure for us to actually build housing. It just speaks to what we want to do as a council to be better stewards of assets. So that's, I guess, just from an initiative name perspective. And then the second piece to that is that when you talked about this being, I guess, the initiative with the largest amount of money, but also scoring slightly lower because of the time it takes. And I was sort of wondering, we already know infrastructure improvements that if we made now will increase housing. So for instance, what we talked about, that corridor where the empty piece of land is next to the fire hall. We know if we did improve that infrastructure there, then it creates a capacity for there to be debt intensification in that particular area. And why wouldn't we target that sort of without even thinking, well, it's a dream, but actually that's something we actually want to target now, so that it gives us more immediacy in what needs to be done, with the expectation that be the more strategic areas if we want to think about improving in other areas. But that one in particular, we know we would want to do. Maybe I'm wrong in thinking that way, but that's a portion If
So
you think
the-
about intensification.
The way
that's
that I would
unfortunately
see
something.
this initiative speaking to that property, just it's good to use it as a specific example.
Yeah.
We first need to look at the asset of the property because it's municipally owned and the asset of the building across the street, both of them.
Yeah.
And looking at that, there's the preliminary work on like what would it take to renovate the building across the street? That's kind of underway. And then there's environmental testing and work to kind of determine what would it take to develop that property. All of that stuff speaks to the repurposing of municipal assets piece, which is included in here. And then there's the expansion of, the utility infrastructure, transportation infrastructure to certain property. All of that, I would expect would be down as, priority number one within this plan. And we do it concurrently. So like we're already, even council's approved starting the work on environmental geotechnical testing on that piece of property. That'll happen before we even get funding. And then if that comes back, and I expect it will on the phase one environmental assessment, it recommends phase two, we'll hopefully know about this funding in time to do the phase two and have the results of the phase two assessment as before this plan is even presented. So this plan will be in development, be able to roll in things like that, even have those things funded. So I don't think it's about, take 2 years and then do things.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that, we have a bigger picture than just the specific addition of a bit of extra pipe or bit, there's infrastructure connects to other infrastructure. It's not, it's mostly system based. So if we're going to make improvements in the water system, how do those connect back to the level of flow that's available? If we say we're putting new hydrants in, what is the flow level in those hydrants? Well, the upgrades to the mains determine the available flow to the hydrants. So there's system stuff to consider in there. Electrical in particular, the extension of lines is one thing, but the expansion of load capacity is another thing. There's transformers, voltage regulators and things like that. So I think it's important that even a local extension like that one be put in the bigger context and, looking at the capacity of the systems to serve that new development. And so the asset management plan would probably say more like, if it's 100 units over the next 3 years and it's 300 units over the next 10 years, well, let's look at the capacity of the systems to serve that and where it's located. And, I think some of the more peripheral areas, so this one is centrally located, but we talk about development on some of the more peripheral areas of town. Then there's also issues that come with a long service corridor. So with electrical or water, the further away it is, the more need there probably is to make system improvements to support it so that the service received at the end of the line is equivalent to the service in the downtown, or at least meets minimum standards in terms of service. So all that is to say, I think the big picture is important, but it's certainly not intended to slow down the immediate action. And as far as the name, I think we could call it anything. I'm disappointed as the chair of the AIM network that asset management has a boring connotation, but I understand that it does. It has sort of come off as a manager's responsibility, which is not a decision maker's responsibility. It should probably be asset governance or something along those lines if we want to, make the point that it's about the strategic decisions of the governing authority, council, in how we use a limited amount of money. I mean, that's ultimately what asset management is supposed to be. So we could certainly change the name. I think maybe the bigger thing would be to emphasize that it's a strategic infrastructure plan.
Yeah.
That would fix it for me.
Yeah.
That'd make it more definitively.
Yeah, because I mean, we'd be doing an asset management plan for each of these infrastructure classes anyway. The point of this one is to bring them together and strategically leverage that investment to support housing growth. So if we call it strategic, I mean, I think it's a really long title. I still like the investment management in there, but I think we probably have to call it strategic infrastructure plan development and delivery, just because strategic asset management and infrastructure plan development and delivery is a very long title. So Eric, we can make that change. I don't think asset management as a buzzword was something they used a lot. If it was, then you mentioned that now, I guess, but. Eric,
Yeah,
did they say? asset
No, I
management?
think it was, I put it in there as sort of emphasizing a more holistic approach than just water, wastewater. And I know that asset management has become a municipal priority throughout the province, so I just added it in.
We'll still use it in the description, but maybe we won't use it in the name to keep the name a little shorter.
Yeah, so I guess the bigger piece for me is as you evaluate, if somebody will be sitting and evaluating this particular proposal, most of the time I would use words that they use. And then they've used infrastructure improvement. They haven't used asset management in their language at all. And so that's one of the pieces, I guess, that jumps out at me. So
Yeah, I don't think they would, I think
infrastructure.
they would probably see the terminology as appropriate, but we can still make that change. So if there's another question specific to that one, I think there may be questions that arise, how these relate together, so I'll just move on to the next one. These are kind of in order of scale, I guess, right now. So community partners is the next largest one. So community partners is the, okay, let's say that we've created the groundwork for development from a planning perspective and infrastructure perspective, or that we will do. Then how, to the question that came up earlier, how do we actually directly influence the development of housing? So this initiative would see the town of Mahone Bay partner with local nonprofit housing organizations and providers to create relationships to make change to affordable housing stock in Mahone Bay. It's important to partner with these organizations to leverage their expertise and capacities for the residents of Mahone Bay. Obviously, the expertise is great, but the capacities is really the key point here, because it does need to be noted that our ability to work with nonprofits is quite different from our ability to work with a for-profit housing developer. The legislation is very dated in that sense. And it just basically says, whether it's a nonprofit and council defines it as a nonprofit, you can give them money, you can give them land, you don't really have to worry about all of the things that are considered to be outside of the scope of municipal jurisdiction if we were to make those same arrangements with a private developer. So it doesn't really give you, the legislation and the constraints on municipalities don't really give us much option if we want to support, directly support and not incentivize the creation of housing, then it needs to be with a nonprofit. And that means we could do a number of different things to support that. Creation of a multi-organizational working group on housing, on actionable items as they relate to affordable housing. So this would be bringing folks in the community together around creation of housing, creating a reserve fund in the town of Mahone Bay budget specifically for contributing to affordable and supported housing projects and housing organization supports. So if we got, let's say, $1 million from this program and we said, here's $1 million fund, apply with your idea. I want to convert the fire hall. I'm close to making it work, but I need $200,000 to make it officially able to be offered as affordable. That will make the difference. Then this fund would be here. People could come to us and say, we want to partner with the town. We want $200,000 to support ours, and we could give it to them as a grant. And that's allowed. That's something we can do under legislation, but only if they're a nonprofit. So that's where, we would need to seek out and encourage the development, in some cases, potentially, of nonprofit partners. Creation of a program to assist with the funding of affordable or supported housing projects. Again, I'm not going to know exactly what form that will take. Identification and transfer of town buildings or properties to partner organizations for development of affordable housing. So this ties into the previous initiative around defining them, ensuring we understand them, have the information about how they need to be renovated or, development constraints, and then dealing with those constraints. And then how do we actually give them to somebody to do something with? If that's what we would do. And to Suzanne's point earlier, do we give out those properties versus do we allow something to be constructed with some type of a long-term arrangement? Like, do we want to play an ownership role? Do we not want to? The tax benefits obviously aren't there in the case of a nonprofit most of the time. Part of what you're doing to incentivize it is you're being asked to provide tax concessions on the resulting construction. So those are all things to consider. Where do you want to draw that line in terms of the municipal involvement? But we won't need to have them sorted now. This eventually, it's one of the further initiatives, we will hire a coordinator to build capacity in this area. So that is part of what we're recommending if we get the funding.
So you had mentioned about giving them 200,000, say if they needed it to complete something. Would that come out of this fund, or would that have to come out of other town?
So that would only be if they gave us this money. And then if they gave us this money, then we put it in, we create a fund, and then we'd use it that way. So it wouldn't come out of any other town funds. I mean, traditionally, we haven't felt that was something that taxpayers' money from our community could contribute to. But if we get money from CMHC, that's literally why they're giving it to us. And basically what they'd be doing is they'd be saying, instead of them giving it to someone, we're local, we have the direct ability to see what the potential developments are. And if one seems real, then we can flow the money in a way that's far more direct, far more, streamlined. And that's where they would see their involvement is give us the money, let us adjudicate how that money is then apportioned to nonprofits to create the best bang for their buck, since they'd be giving us the money. So we'd become a go-between in that sense, but it's what we, I think, have always said in terms of the value of local government. We could do it better. So now they're saying, well, if we gave it to you, how would you do it better?
So on the other side of the coin, if we were to, we're talking about giving land to somebody to develop, would the town be able to recoup any of those costs for this fund?
Yes, well, and any costs associated with the like preparation of the land and things like that would be covered here.
Without as far as the value of the land goes or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's the one thing that we would not really be, we would be giving up that we currently own that isn't funded by this. If we gave land or donated the building, the town wouldn't likely be compensated for that under this program.
And that person could sell that asset.
So that depends. So if you give a piece of land away with no constraints, obviously the next day somebody can turn around and sell that land.
Yeah.
If you give a piece of land away, you can place certain constraints on it, but it also depends who you're giving it to. So if you give a piece of land to a cooperative, for example, under federal legislation governing cooperatives, they can't turn around and get rid of that land. So it has to be retained for that purpose. Like there are different, but and also sometimes, like when I was in Shelburne, one of our main goals was to figure out how to get that land into private hands. So it depends on what you're looking for. In our environment in Mahone Bay, we're not really necessarily looking to get municipal land into private hands for development. In Shelburne's case, they had massive amounts of municipal land because the town was built for 25,000 people and had 3,000 people, and now it has 1,700 people. And the town ended up with all the land, and they wanted to just give away building lots, and they couldn't give away building lots because you can't give building lots to an individual. So in that case, the absolute goal of the municipality would have been partner with a nonprofit just to give them the units and then have them turn around and give them out to people somehow, which is in fact how the Habitat for Humanity functions. That is what they do. They turn around, they give it out to somebody, and then it's their equity.
Yes.
And in Shelburne's case, that was something we wanted to achieve. In Mahone Bay's case, we have very few municipal land assets, so I think we would want to see them used in a more intense way than simply single home development. So it's probably not really an issue for us just because of our scarcity of land assets. But anything is possible. It just depends on the capacity to do it the way you intended to do it to achieve the results you intend to achieve. And that's where capacity building is the subject of most of the next three initiatives. The question was, I was going to start again, but
No, it's not a question, it's sort of a comment around. So when I think about just Mahone Bay, there's only one nonprofit actor. When I think of the South Shore, there's not that many. And then so just in my mind, just questioning, and I'm not saying it's a wrong direction to go, questioning the creation of another. I think if you go up there, it talks about
the possibility of creating an organizational working group.
Yeah, and wondering why not use SHAC?
Yeah,
So
I
it's
mean,
already a coalition of affordable housing folks. Then that's just a question for me. If you create another layer, is it really helpful in the community?
I would like to think that this could take whatever form made sense, practically speaking. So if we got the approval, we initiate the conversation, it becomes clear it should happen at the SHAC table, that would probably be fine with the way this is described.
Yeah.
But it might also become clear that like
It's
something
not
Mahone Bay specific with some of the same involvement as the actors in SHAC needs to come into existence to focus it on Mahone Bay, like, because the whole thing is like, let's do something in town. And I know that traditionally SHAC like has drawn the line, as most housing groups do, at not actually talking about like specific projects. And so that's where, but I think it could, like, we wouldn't want to do this totally independently of the existing coalition.
Yeah, and then maybe there's to create in that, I guess, initiative, creating the possibility that can be a consideration rather than just saying creating. It might be a case of.
Well, I mean, I would probably
explore.
change creation to establishment, which is barely any different, but.
Or explore the establishment or creation of a. Yeah, so that.
And would you include, and consultation with the existing, with Shack as part of that same action?
Yeah, I mean, I think to establish a multi-organizational working group, we would start by discussing it with the existing actors, and then we'd figure out what needs to happen from there. It may really not be necessary to do anything different than what's being done. But, you know, at the same time, we've had a couple of occasions where the South Shore Open Doors Association has had interest in properties in town. And the town has had no awareness of that directly. We've only become aware of it through third parties. Is that how we should become aware of it? Or should we probably be aware of the Open Doors Association's objectives for housing in Mahone Bay ahead of time? So that's where, you know, something now isn't necessarily connecting.
I'm just going to speak again to the possible value of including reference specifically to Shack, so that it's known in the app, it makes it clear in the application that there is that resource available to us.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful for the application in some ways.
Well, I'm not sure that it will be, but I've added a little note about it there. I know it would be, practically speaking, something we would want to do. You know, changing things from do something to explore something isn't going to strengthen the application. I don't think anyone would say, you know, oh, you didn't include a reference to local housing association, then you didn't know it existed, or that weakens your, but anyway, I've put in building on the work of the local housing coalition, and I guess that is something.
Yeah, I think you have to be a little bit careful about being too parochial. Just my guess, because people, you know, if I was a bureaucrat sitting in Ottawa, looked at it and said, Shack, what the hell is that?
Well, we've totally avoided references to existing actors in the community. Like, we know that FCM has already funded our local cooperative housing group to look at a town building, but we haven't referenced that specifically in this application. And that's sort of a decision we've made of, once you start in that direction, the word limits and attachment options, and like, we would have a completely different application here. And it's just not what, I don't think, what the scope they're looking for at this stage. Like, because at that point, you're down to where are the developments, what are the streets, what are the groups, what are the, you know, and that's just not what they're looking for at this stage. It's been our understanding, right, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, they've said several times that, you know, funding is not eligible for things that have already begun or have significantly begun. So having those finite details or definite details, I think, would indicate that something has already begun and might actually work against the application in some instances.
So that's where, you know, the establishment of a working group, building on the work of the local housing coalition, still is an action. Continuation of an existing thing isn't an action. And in that sense, I think this is the best we can do. So just moving on here with this, the expected results of this is growing, increase in equitable and diverse housing for growing population, because what we're talking about here is, this is the one that could involve supportive house supports for supportive housing. So basically, if we've got a definition of affordability and we bake that definition into some aspects of our land use planning, for example, so there could be, it's, and there's another action that speaks more to this, but like, there could be incentives within land use planning. But if you're building supportive housing, or you're doing something that's that ambitious, really look at non-market options, directly supporting it with money from the municipal side through this fund that we're talking about establishing, this would be necessary. Like, that's not market housing. So when you think about what does non-market mean, it means it's not happening unless the government puts money into it. And so this is money. So that's the main point of this initiative, and it's the reason we're trying to stress that it's not just creating more units, it's not just creating more single detached units. This is the part where you're investing in those value add housing options. This particular initiative speaks most strongly to that, and then some of the other ones speak to capacity around that. And I just wanted to go back up because I forgot to mention, this was also the fifth bullet point, just where I went into the questions there. Support the creation and establishment, maintenance of inventory of affordable and supported housing options in Mahone Bay. So this is basically in order to address Councillor Wilson's earlier point about is council going to be able to achieve its objectives around the number of units that are affordable? Well, we need to better understand how many units are affordable in the community. So this would take that into consideration as well. We had to have that somewhere, so it's in this one.
Before you scroll too far away, Dylan, oh, no, keep going into the box under, going, there's a spelling error.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I'm sure there'll be a couple, but.
Oh, do you want it now?
No, yeah, sure, yeah.
Stop. By part, in the second to last line of that box, by partnering with a bread.
Oh.
Thank you.
I may have sighed as I typed.
All right.
I just want to look at number 2 again. So one of the, in just thinking about the non-profit world and supporting them, one of the challenges of small organizations, for instance, like the cooperative we're part of, is volunteers come together, you try to figure out a way to work. There is some level of growth and support that is required. Right now, we're getting funding from the province to be able to do governance development, whereby everybody that comes to the table actually understands their role and how that is different. Is that something we would want to support or not? Because right now we just have one, the Mahone Bay Cooperative. If we want to encourage more non-profit actors in Mahone Bay, that is something that might need some support going down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that action and then a couple of the other actions as speaking to that. I guess I would not say right now, I think it's the housing strategy development piece, which is the next one, that would kind of inform whether that is a necessary thing. Because as I said about the case in Shelburne, like what Shelburne needed was a different kind of nonprofit with a different mandate. And, you know, they needed a Habitat for Humanity type situation, because what they were trying to achieve needed that type of a group with that type of mandate. And what we're trying to achieve would maybe be different organizations with different mandates. So I do think that that is a consideration. And I think it mostly speaks to the third one here, affordable housing strategy, which is, you know, council's already defined as a goal, and which is something that would happen like very quickly if we got this funding approval. So I just didn't want to lose our changes because we were about to hit the 30-minute reset thing on the timing. So I had to save that. So now I've come back in and I'm just going to go back down to say, so this one scores better because this initiative is essentially setting things up right away. So like if we got the money, we create a reserve, we create a working group, we, you know, have the processes to facilitate. That would all get done within the first year. And then if groups can take up on it, they can take up on it, but we would do everything to set the groundwork right away. So this scores very well because it's like, what can you do? You can do it right now, make the money immediately available, it'll have a big impact. So that's scores well. And then in terms of the actual timeline here, create the working group would be in the new year. So basically, because one of the next actions involves the coordinator, that would need to be done first, and then the working group would be established in the new year. And then the funding of reserves with this is aligned to the budget process. So if we've had the money, then we do this, then through our budget process, we establish this as something. We also know Asha's working on reserve policy now, so that'll give us the context for council to establish new reserves within that structure.
Forgive me if I'm down in the weeds, but who do you visualize being part of the working group, a working group?
So this is what we were just talking about in terms
Sorry,
of whether the working group would replace Shack or be a complement to Shack, or so from my perspective, obviously what I'm thinking is we know we have the cooperative group locally, but we know we have regional groups, the deputy mayor mentioned, like South Shore Open Doors Association, and then there are provincial entities that have an interest potentially in housing. They may or may not wish to be at the table, and that's from the Cooperative Federation side. It's also from the provincial, you know, department side, the housing authority side. So, you know, who would be a part of this working group is going to depend on one side on our objectives for it, but on the other side on, you know, who wants to be a part of it. So I don't have the answers. Yeah,
What
exactly.
we want them to do.
Exactly. So I don't have the answers now about it, but I think that would be one of the things that terms of reference would be put forward by our coordinator once they're hired, and council would contemplate that, and then we'd try to create the thing, and yeah. So it's, so if we don't get the funding, I don't think we want to overcommit, so we have to know that we get the funding before we get going. And all of the timelines here are based on them turning their funding around by October, because that's what they've indicated they would do, which is hard to imagine.
Is the coordinator's position funded from the same?
It's a different one of these initiatives, but it's the same pot of $3.5 million.
Okay.
Yeah. So all of this stuff presumes no contribution from the town, except to Councilor Now's point. If we were donating physical assets, we didn't contemplate that being funded. So that was the one area, but this also doesn't commit us to anything like that. This is just, we know that, I haven't mentioned in here that we have a building and a piece of property, and we've talked about making them available. So they're not referenced in here specifically.
And how?
Councillor Lawrence Croft?
Will there be citizen engagement or participation in this as we progress?
Definitely in certain
Coordinator.
aspects here. So this one I'm about to talk about, this initiative asset, this is the affordable housing strategy. This one would certainly have substantial citizen participation. In terms of the development of the strategic infrastructure plan, as we decided to call it, that one would not have substantial citizen participation, but it would be built on the basis of this one, and they would happen relatively concurrently with this one finishing first. So then that would result in that one being mapped to this one, but that's like an engineering project. So this is the public facing engagement related activity. And then the partnerships one, I mean, there could be a role on a working group for public members. I personally imagine it not being that kind of a working group, but that's not my determination to make. So, as council looks at terms of reference, as we get a coordinator, as we get to that stage, maybe there is some, or maybe that working group needs to carry out some public engagement. But I think the idea in my mind is the working group is focused on, project work. And so it's not about just hearing from people about the need for stuff, which I think, I guess, maybe Shack is better as kind of an advocacy organization. It kind of walks the line of being an advocacy organization despite having municipal membership.
But we do have a lot of citizens who are well versed in housing and different types of housing globally, that it's working in other countries, and but they would have ideas that may fit into housing.
I mean, what I would say to that is I would hope that they would join the nonprofit organizations that would partner with us and be a part of the working group. Like I would hope that if someone feels they can support the creation of cooperative housing, they would join our local cooperative group, or if someone feels they have expertise in supportive housing, they would work with the South Shore Open Doors Association. That I'm not trying to be dismissive of that expertise, but I don't think the town is going, even with a coordinator, to really be able to capture just the good ideas, but no actual time or resource commitment. Like, we're not just here to hear from people about the good ideas, so we're going to action, So I sometimes feel that housing struggles with that. It's a bit of a roadblock.
So in answering that question properly, those folks will be consulted through this affordable housing strategy process. If you're building an affordable housing strategy for the town of Mahone Bay, it requires that we consult folks. So my thought, so if I'm to apply to that position that you'll be putting up to be the coordinator, I would force you and the town to actually listen to those folks through this process. I'm assuming that whoever will bring on as a consultant or staff that will be doing the coordination process, they will come with ideas as to how that strategy will be built. And my thinking is that if we're building a housing strategy, then there will be a significant public engagement process whereby we're talking to residents about how housing will be developed. So I'm not too worried about that side of things. I think we have the initiative, and this initiative and the amount of money that's been put there, it's quite a chunk of money. I would say it will allow us to be able to consult folks like that. And now there are those who are already engaged in the nonprofit sector.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to make the distinction between people who just want to come out and describe the need and opportunity, and people who actually have expertise that can be part of the solution.
Yeah.
And they both will have a way to participate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in addition, I mean, it's great to know that there's a wealth of expertise and interest in the community. But the community has already had an opportunity to input to this because they were specifically asked for their thoughts for this.
And to the needs assessment that the province carries.
Yeah, yes, and they have an opportunity to join SHAC, or as the deputy mayor said, the local cooperative group. And they could run for council in just over a year. To have more of have more input if they feel strongly about it. So I'm not feeling concerned that there's a lack of opportunity to channel their thoughts, or they could write a letter.
They could run for council.
I don't mean-
Applies for this job.
I don't mean that, I don't mean that in a dismissive way at all. I mean that with all due respect, because I think there've been lots of channels and lots of ways to be involved.
Yeah, I'm sorry if my response came off as dismissive. It really was just meant to reflect that there are lots of opportunities here and existing for people to participate. I don't think anyone's gonna feel they're on the outside looking in with respect to the process. And in fact, we're probably the most transparent unit in the province, walking through line by line our entire application on YouTube. Okay, so just moving on with this, actually moving on with this one, because I didn't even get into it. So this strategy would focus on long-term, this strategy would have a long-term focus on affordable housing. So we said in our strategic plan that the purpose of the housing strategy would be to focus on affordable housing. So that's what this is.
And
So-
affordable is yet to be defined.
The one, that's where it will be defined, and it may be different tiers of affordability defined, like non-market and market affordable. There may be different definitions that'll all come through this process. You know, as Councilor Carver said, it's really building on the initial bit of engagement we've had through the needs assessment and the development of this application and action plan. So the strategy would have a 10 to 20-year vision, intersectional approach, looking at affordable housing in isolation is problematic. So it can ignore intersecting factors that contribute to issues of affordable housing like race, gender, education, country of origin, et cetera. By having an affordable housing strategy that not only looks at housing as a stock number, it will allow the town of Mahone Bay to create solutions to other issues that will have long-term systemic and cultural change on how we as a population view housing, which is prioritized by HF. So to Deputy Mayor's point about, you know, they have a view, they express it, the words they want to use. You know, this is ideally the type of outcomes that they'd like to see, not just the creation of housing stock, but a transformation in the way that housing is viewed and its role in the economy and all of that type of stuff. So that's all stuff we would need to include within the development of our strategy. It would be impossible to imagine it would all be straightened out now. That's the whole idea. We're building capacity to do this in a way that is going to be more complete than it could have been without their support. Strategy would include following components: creation of a strategy for upgrading maintenance of existing affordable housing stock, as well as creation of new housing stock, municipal bylaw amendment development to facilitate expansion or improvement of affordable housing stock, grants and funding programs, for example, affordable housing grants, review of low income tax exemption levels, et cetera, changes to zoning and land use requirements, creation of partnerships with other levels of government and nonprofit organizations, changes to and realignment of municipal programs and policies, review and investment in active transportation, consideration of accessibility, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So essentially, a strategy will cover all the stuff that's included in all the other initiatives, but it will do so under a framework that is going to be quite a bit more developed and intersectional than what we could do in putting this application together. And it has a long-term, again, long-term impact is greater than the short-term impact because it's a 10 to 20-year strategy and it includes the other components here. So like the strategy will say, we do expansions of infrastructure, we create a reserve to fund these, you know, developments. Like these other initiatives are part of the strategy. The strategy is one of the initiatives because creating the strategy is a distinct initiative. But ultimately, the strategy is our way of pulling together all of these initiatives and then beyond the term of this project, carrying them forward. So the strategy is quite a bit more than in isolation as one initiative. It's how all the initiatives will actually come together. In that sense, this one is scoring kind of, you know, it's better because the initiative itself, creation of the strategy, will take place within a year. Then the actual benefits are a little slower, so just a little bit lower score for that. The milestones are significant here, so this is not the one under which we put the staff position, and they're not awarding the initiatives independently anyway, but the staff position is in one of the last two, and we'll get to that one. So presuming the staff position exists and is filled this fall, then we tender for a consultant by January. Difficult to do over Christmas, so by January at the latest. And then the plan would be developed through the late winter and into the spring. And the plan would then become approved by council, by May or June. And that's really the same timeline that we've already envisioned absent this program. It's that this council wants to have that strategy in place within your term. That's what we'd be looking at, and implementation thereafter. So estimated completion date of 2025 for implementation. Well, that's just to say that like the things that need to be put in place to carry it forward for the coming 10 years would be put in place by that point. It's not to say that the entire strategy would be accomplished by that point. Does anyone have any questions about that one before I go on to the next one? Again, stressing that the coordinator and everything's not included here.
Yeah, so I trust that it will be included because you did mention it will be in this one.
Yes, it's in the next, I think it's in the next one. No, maybe it's in one of these next two right
Okay.
now. And we can put it anywhere. I mean, I don't think that will change how they view it, but.
Yeah.
Building and development process review. So, this one, council's mentioned, I think, a number of occasions, that Suzanne has certainly mentioned on some occasions. The town of Mahone Bay is currently engaged in the Mahone Bay process, review Mahone Bay land use. Part of this process, the town's taking step outlined in HAF to increase housing. With that in mind, one area this review to emphasize Mahone Bay is more effectively encouraging construction during the building and development phases, particularly in permitting, inspection fees, etc. So this initiative would include a review of current practices, bylaws, and shared service agreements related to our permitting and zoning, inclusionary zoning practices, which may include amendment of bylaws, review of current permitting practices for Mahone Bay with recommendations for future opportunities, examination of software available to help streamline and automate parts of the permitting process, review of current fee structures for building and development in Mahone Bay, addition of housing support staff for the town, creation of incentives to encourage gentle density and affordable development in Mahone Bay, and aligns with the HAF objectives in a number of ways. So, essentially this one, and there's some strategy to putting the staff capacity thing in here in terms of higher staff. So essentially this one, how do I want to say this? So we have building and development services now, and we have them under contract from the municipality of Chester, and they are aligned with our, obviously they're implementing our plan strategy and our land use bylaw, and they're overseeing our subdivision bylaw and our local fire protection, such as it differs, which it really doesn't, but it could, from provincial standards in that regard. All of that is being done to the level of the contract that we have with them, essentially. Improvements that we can't define at this point may be something that we can do in partnership with Chester. They may be something that over time results in a different approach or a higher need or an increased capacity there. So what we're thinking is that by tying the creation of a term position, housing coordinator position to this, and having them directly working on the initiative of streamlining the building and development process, then they're also going to potentially become a part of that process going forward. So we are concerned about capacity in building and development. It's possible that the housing coordinator role becomes a permanent addition to the capacity for building and development, and in potentially is envisioned in the application involves bringing certain services back in-house. That role could grow rather than end at the end of this project. It could be that this results in an understanding that we actually need more building and development services in-house, or that those building and development services that we contract can be better utilized with a navigator on our side to streamline the process for the development services staff. So this one is where we put the role of the coordinator, but the coordinator would have the role of also overseeing the tendering and administration of the various contracts associated with the other initiatives. So it's just a matter of, there is something strategic in saying that the capacity building here is a more long-term effort than the capacity building around developing a strategy or developing an infrastructure plan.
Councilor Wilson.
Yeah.
And then Deputy Mayor.
Just wondering, well, I see where you're headed with this, but my question is that we deal with Chester, and depending on the circumstances, we may get the person who hands out the building permits, or we may get the head planner, or we may get a deputy head planner, or whatever they're called. And we wrap all those various roles up into one individual so that we're paying for everything once rather than having sort of three people popping in and out on occasional basis, which is what we have now.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of advantage in having, like, this is the same thing that we would pitch when we were offering financial services. Like, you want to have the team with the different strengths, different capacities, but at the same time, how you use them is more discretionary. So I would see it more like, on one hand, yes, we could just have our own planning and housing person who's just a town employee, but we could also have a person who is supported by an external contract with Chester, but who does a lot of the on the ground stuff dealing with the developments, so that essentially it's only passed on at a level of, well, this is basically ready to go kind of thing. Because a lot of what, I mentioned that Councilor Lawrence-Croft was referencing, that we had people who would say, I wanted to build in town and I found the process slow or cumbersome. The goal here is to fix that. And whether that's fixed by applying more resources in the same manner in which they're currently applied, or having like some additional frontline service utilizing software and potentially capacity in our office to streamline that process, where we still have some contracted services in the mix, but that they're being used more effectively. So I don't have the solutions here, because that's the theme of this, is that we're not aware right now of exactly how to fix the situation, but that in so doing, we'd be building capacity locally that would transcend the time of the duration of this project.
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, so that for me, there's a couple of things that, I think it makes sense that if you're going to do such a project that there's capacity to be able to tackle these things. I think that the budget is too low. Too low in the sense on two aspects. If you're hiring staff, this tells me you're hiring staff for maybe not even a whole year, probably. And then the other piece is, if we're going to investigate inclusionary zoning as part of this initiative, there needs to be a buffer of funding there that actually allows us to be able to pilot that in a substantial way, rather than just say we will have a report and then the report gets action, maybe. But I think there needs to be some funding that will support inclusionary zoning to happen in a tangible way. So I would advocate, and this might be, if I'm applying for that job.
Wait a second, now you want to raise.
Now I want to raise. I would advocate that the project sort of would stick to three to 5 years kind of timeline. That person be.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. My way of looking at this had been like, each of these contributes to the total cost, but where we put the position under this heading, it probably does make some sense to make sure that there's enough cost under this heading. I guess the only concern I had there was like, we're basically up saying like $300,000 for this, where a lot of the benefit of the position is that they're not overseeing those other initiatives.
Right,
And it's not necessarily accurate to say that this initiative would cost 300,000, because it's only the part of the coordinator's time spent on this initiative.
Yeah.
But then if that's the case, should we list the milestone of hire a coordinator at the beginning of all the initiatives?
And that was what I was gonna.
So maybe that's the
Have
better
it-
solution.
Have it in each initiative that there would be added staff capacity.
And we just say in each initiative that the first milestone is hire the coordinator, with the exception of the asset management one, everything was gonna wait on the coordinator to get rolling anyway. Yeah, so maybe that's what we should do, add the milestone. Eric, can you make a note, cause I can't change them all now. I'll
Yeah, I'm just going to wait for this.
take us too much to change them all now. But I think that's a good point. It should be clear. I mean, I think it would be clear to somebody reading this holistically, but if, you know, you gotta connect a lot of dots to get there, so.
And then so they, is the intention in your thinking that this will be much longer than just.
So my thought was that the initial term for this employee would match the term of the project.
Yeah.
So we'd be doing, you know, something like a 3-year term. And then by the time that we've gotten, you know, each of these annual check-ins with the funder, will also inform the objectives for that position. And so if we're finding that like we don't get, like we get the funding up front and then we file our first thing and they're like, you know, we're gonna pay this back, then the coordinator would basically be like in wrap-up mode by the end of the 3 years. Or if things are going gangbusters and the council feels that it's important to sustain it beyond that period, council will have that opportunity. And I mean, that's the same way we've approached other coordinator roles in the past. They might continue, they might not continue. It's gotta be a term to start. But we'll probably have very good sense within the project whether it is going to become more than that. And what funds might continue to support it going forward. Like one of the things to consider is, you know, are we going to have a way to fund things after this project? Something like that fund, if we create a reserve, anyone can contribute to it. So the question becomes, will there be sources of contributions to that fund after this project? And, you know, similarly, would we be willing to create other funding mechanisms dedicated to housing that would continue to, and I think one of them might be around this particular piece of the actual planning and development service. We don't pay very much because it's, you know, we're contracting and we have a relatively defined scope of what we're gonna do. If that needs to cost more to achieve more results, that line item in our budget might go up in the course of this to meet the absence of this funding at the end of this program. If council has determined that that is something that is a priority, like that's something we'll have to figure out, you know, but at a minimum, I think the project term would coincide with, or the position term would coincide with the project term. Any other questions about this one here? We got a good note about adding the coordinator.
Can we take a break?
Good idea. I was just
It's 2 hours in.
signaling to the CAO that we're at the 2-hour point.
Well, there's only one more initiative, so I'm good on that. We can take a break before we go over the next initiative. That's fine with me.
So we've got a couple of more items.
We do. I'm thinking they're quick. Maybe they won't be as quick as I'm thinking. I was gonna leave a minimum of a half hour for the
So
other.
it's not-
two.
Let's take a 10-minute break. It is 11:12. Got 48 minutes. Get through.
Well, so the last one on this list is disincentive programs. And it fits in with all the others, so essentially, the town is, as it says here, the town is quite small. There is idle land, to the extent that this land could be made available for housing, there are certain steps that may be able to be taken to encourage that, both in terms of incentive and disincentive actions. So obviously, this is something that will rely on the coordinator to drive the, exploration and implementation of incentives and disincentives. But it's essentially, including a number of potential actions.
Back it up, I'm just, that first paragraph again, okay,
Sorry.
thank you,
Yeah, if you want to read it, I just thought I'd go a little quicker.
okay. The negative discouragement of idle lands by way of increased property taxes?
So potentially, tax and fees regime can try to incentivize construction or disincentivize idle land. There's limited options, and Nova Scotia's particularly constrains municipalities in terms of their powers in these areas. So we have an incentive currently for non-resident land ownership. That's incentivized in the sense that there's some tax and fee reductions associated with that. Is there potentially a way to create a disincentive on idle lands? I mean, it's again, I'm not here to say there is, but I think there are things that can be explored. And here's the list that I was about to get to. Implementation of marketing levy on short-term tourism properties. So that's sort of intended to swing the balance a little bit with respect to why is it more advantageous for someone to have a short-term than a long-term rental? That would be considered a disincentive. Zoning changes for idle or empty land to facilitate housing development. So that might be in the line of if something, a property has industrial or commercial use and then ceases to have that use for a period of time. If it is otherwise a non-conforming use in residential zone, we would more actively reset the zoning to residential in order to facilitate residential development. So we might lose your commercial or industrial or institutional zoning over time. Increase taxes or charges for idle lands, empty housing units. Again, we'd have to determine what that could look like, legally speaking, but it's worth exploring. Incentive programs to promote landowners to develop housing on idle land. Incentive programs to support the reconstruction of large-scale single-use dwellings into multi-unit dwellings. There's a lot of talk about that in communities that have older housing stock. Much of it is very large. We have some of that in Mahone Bay. How could that potentially be facilitated for smaller developments? So it's underutilized, like
So
one person
these are all
could do that.
things that we're suggesting to them that council could consider.
Yeah, that a
Implementing with the
coordinator
support
would
of the
explore
commissioner.
and then we
Yes.
could consider, yeah.
Okay,
Creation of a rebate program for long-term rental landlords. So just their incentives and disincentives, they're all under various, but essentially this would be, the position would be established, they would explore options for disincentives and incentives, and then based on the viability of those, then they would be able to recommend them to the council. And it just would involve a scan of the existing environment, particularly with respect to legislation, and then implementation thereafter.
Councillor Wilson and then Deputy Mayor.
Just to comment on the data, either read very fast or there's a typo.
Above,
Well, it starts on the 31st of October and ends on the same day.
One of those quick ones.
If I'm reading it correctly.
oh,
Yeah.
Yeah,
oh, yes,
Yeah.
all right, so that
Sorry,
was the end date down here, yeah, so it should be starting on this year.
Yeah,
13th
the
of
start date
September.
should be 2023, not
Okay,
2024.
good. I just put.
No, thank you.
Deputy Mayor.
That, well, now it matches below. Oh, it's the wrong year.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think in the initiatives themselves, there are incentives and disincentives. And so I was wondering why you chose the name of the initiative to just be disincentive programs. Just talks to you.
Yeah, that's a
without
good
being very
reason.
negative.
That's a very good reason for that.
So maybe incentives and disincentives.
Incentives slash disincentives, yeah.
Yeah,
Carrot and stick.
I'm slightly concerned about the level of detail to a certain extent.
Much or too little?
Yeah, too much. There's a little bit of prescription that some folks in the community will be very uncomfortable about.
Because we're
Especially,
putting this on YouTube. So.
yeah, especially around as a following on from our expropriation and our political conversations. I think we need to be slightly softer around how we have that conversation. And then maybe it might be, I would rather that gets informed to a certain extent by the strategy planning process, whereby citizens and engage to provide language for us a lot more. I'd be okay with this, but I think we'll probably get some flack for how.
So I was looking at the actual, like this list of actual things the plan can include. Is there, I can make changes on the fly now, but is there something in particular? I was looking to see, as you said, if this said like specifically, repurposing existing idle land, but the only thing about that was just.
It might have been in the description.
Oh, yeah, well, maybe it's more in the description.
But it might be more productive to just have a bullet point that says taxing strategies rather than being too specific about what they exactly might be. Because I'm sure there's plenty of disagreement around this table about what they might be,
Yeah,
never mind within the community.
and then maybe provincial
And maybe-
regulations that
Yeah,
prevent us from doing that.
And what was your suggestion again?
just to have a
Change
bullet
taxing
point called
strategy.
taxing strategies rather than getting very specific about incentives and disincentives.
Councilor Owens-Croft?
I'm just thinking about zoning changes, empty land. So, are we gonna have a checkerboard in our commercial zone? If, we don't see things being facilitated as we would like, are we gonna? It doesn't make sense that we have certain zoning and distances, but are we just gonna pick properties that are sitting in the middle of a zoning that and turn them into a housing?
So the comment about zoning, is essentially zoning where existing zoning doesn't support housing development. And if it is not being used for that purpose, changing the zoning to residential. There aren't many of those in Mahone Bay. I don't really want to pick on specific properties on the public session here, but traditionally a problem for municipalities is previous commercial and industrial operations wrap up and then they allow their land to become fallow for generations potentially. Much of the time there's no interest in looking at that land. I mean, here's something that's not local. I think I could safely use an example. Irving's property holding company, Cobalt, they hold the properties forever, for life. They will never let them
Yeah.
go unless you approach them, in which case they might. But they're not going to otherwise. So if Irving has a property in your community, regardless of the prior use, it will be a vacant piece of land for all time unless the municipality tries to do something about that. That's not really a problem for us, but there are a couple of pieces of underutilized commercially and industrially zoned properties in town.
Councilor Carter?
I'm perfectly comfortable with the title incentives slash disincentives. And I would maybe stress that these items are would be there for consideration, and that in the first introductory statement, that it say might include rather than may include, just stressing that they're up for discussion, not and that council will review and decide.
So here's two changes. I changed it to this plan could include, and then number 3, Councillor Wilson's exploration of possible financial disincentives for idle land or empty housing units. That doesn't reference taxation. So hopefully that helps.
Does it still suggest, though, that if you've got a chunk of land that's vacant, then it can be reprofiled to residential without your agreement,
Yes.
which amounts to, it's approaching the expropriation aspect. There was
So
one thing to
currently, our
expropriate.
planning strategy allows for, as they all do, every one that I've ever seen, it is very standard. A non-conforming use that is not being used for that purpose for 12 months is supposed to revert to the conforming land use in that area. And it just simply doesn't because we don't do it. Like it's supposed to. And then if you actually look at it, who is going to ask Heather, is this still happening? Is this was a restaurant? Did that restaurant close? Did somebody actually think to come back to Heather and say that restaurant closed? So a lot of the time, a property that's been zoned commercial will stay commercial for decades after the commercial activity ended. And so what we're talking about in that case is exercising the existing land use bylaw municipal planning strategy tool of reclassifying it because of the year that they had to continue that business elapsed.
So does that in effect mean that the property owner really does not have discretion over their own property? If Deputy Mayor were to choose to leave his land undeveloped, you're saying that after a particular amount of time, the town could cause it to revert to residential, regardless of what it had.
If you had a property that had a commercial operation on it and the operation ceased, then if the operation remained dormant long enough, we would currently have the ability to
How long is
rezone it.
long enough?
More than a year. is
More,
what
more than a
current-
year is
yeah,
how it's defined?
Yeah,
Okay,
so these are, I think we just went over, these are tools that could be included. I think that's an easy one to look at, but it doesn't
yeah, and I
have to
think
be.
it's, as Councillor Carver suggested, it's important that the citizens realize that that is the case in being identified in this process. It could be, not gonna be, could be.
And that, I mean, that's what it says.
It's been changed to could.
Now it's been changed, yeah.
So for me, for purposes of that conversation, I think we've addressed just the concern that like was there for me. But I think as we go along, there'll be lots of pieces that come with it.
Yeah, I agree.
So any one of these items would always come back to council for.
Yes, I mean, that's the thing. These items would all get baked into the housing strategy if they were going to be actioned. So really the thing is, the housing strategy is gonna pull all these together. And in the meantime, the work has to get done. So if you look at the timing, this basically is designed to start when we hire a coordinator and then end the environmental scan and program development, end when we begin the housing strategy engagement. So it's like, get this figured out so that we know what we can do and then put those tools at the disposal of the strategy is basically what this point refers to. Because in this conversation evidenced already a lot of uncertainty around what we can do with respect to these tools, because CMHC is saying these are things you could do in some jurisdictions. But Nova Scotia has different rules and ours are actually more restrictive in many ways to what municipality can do. So that's the fifth piece. So now, it's a lot to hold together, 2 hours of conversation, but essentially this multi-pronged approach to say, how would we spend the 3.5 million to create 82 incremental new units? And this is how it would be. We would hire a coordinator right away in the fall. They would immediately put out requested proposals to develop the asset, the infrastructure, the strategic infrastructure plan, to develop the housing strategy, to engage in this. They would engage at the same time as they were overseeing the award of those contracts. They would engage in a review of the current situation with respect to incentives and disincentives. And the lay of the land with respect to actors in terms of partnership development. And then we would have those contracts awarded in the new year, and then consultants would be working on the infrastructure plan and the housing strategy piece with our coordinator who was here. They would be working to ensure that all those different pieces get pulled together The strategy would be approved by council by May. The associated infrastructure plan would be approved by council by July. Those things would all be taken care of, and the coordinator would have those things, and they would essentially, their work over the following 2 years would essentially be informed by that strategy. So the strategy would have a resource to carry it forward, which I think is important. So that is the big picture. And then ultimately, when it comes down to the breakdown of the budget, I wanted to come back to that spreadsheet real quick, because what we didn't talk about, and it was already in the staff report to last month's meeting, was how that breaks down between. I thought I was doing something every half hour. I've been pretty sure to come in every half hour, make sure I did something. So so I'm just going to switch to the spreadsheet again, because just in the staff report that we previously looked at, there was a breakdown of the initiatives that put them all in one place. And that is right here. I'm just going to try to get it up on your screen. Okay. So this puts the initiatives all in one place, and I think we'll have to go back and so if you take all the initiatives together, what is being flowed in each year, so you saw like some of them had 150, some of them had 100. This will rebalance it if we try to put the coordinator piece, will describe it so that the coordinator's in the different initiatives, but then what happens here is it's all put into one stream of money anyway. So it's like, this is not which initiative is what. Every initiative has to have its targets, but then the targets have to flow to the whole application. Every initiative has to have its costing, but then that costing has to flow to the whole application. So when it's all flowed to the whole application, then it's broken down over the time, and this is how it breaks down. And this was reflected in staff report Eric did for your previous meeting. So it's essentially saying in year one, $200,000, year two, 200,000, year three, 200,000. Those 200,000s represent the coordinator and the strategies and the capacity building and the community group partnerships and the bylaw overhauls and the investigation of inclusive zoning, and all of that stuff is that 200,000 a year, 600,000 over the 3 years. That's that. And then the remainder of it, the remainder of almost the full $3 million remaining, is these next three categories, which are investments in affordable housing, investments in housing related infrastructure, and investments in community related infrastructure that supports housing. So those are not well defined, like what that consists of. Within those initiatives, you can see how they map to the different initiatives, but which infrastructure, which housing projects, that's not defined. That's to be determined by the strategy and the infrastructure plan. So what we're saying is that, like, of the 3.6 million, the 0.6 is the capacity building, the planning, that stuff. And then the 3 is creation of housing, building of infrastructure, so that breakdown is significant here, just to show, like, overall, what portion of this is going to be real investment in infrastructure and housing. And if you look at that and say, your classic, like, how much money that goes to the Red Cross actually goes to shelters versus administration, or people always talk about that kind of stuff. I think if you look at it that way, 1/6 is what we're talking about on all the planning and capacity building, and 5/6 is what we're talking about on flowing money directly to housing construction or building infrastructure. And I mean, I think that's the ratio, the sort of ratio that this should be going for, albeit if they come back and say it could only have 600,000, the ability to do anything with that 600,000 is greatly constrained by the lack of the matching $3 million, right? Like, why make all these plans if there's no money associated to implement it? So that's the big picture. And I just wanted to kind of come around to that, because at the end of the day, you're basically saying to the CMHC, if we submit this application, our commitment is to make sure this money is properly spent. And so that's the last thing I have to say about this, but
the funding that's going to be realized as a result of this application, if it is approved, to achieve very specific housing options and related supports to allow that to happen, there's no cost to the town.
There's no cost to the town within this 3.6 million. if in order to achieve these things, let's say, investments in, the housing related infrastructure, that's expansion of utilities and that type of thing. If that can coincide with other infrastructure improvement priorities, quite possibly this money isn't going to stand alone. It's going to be leveraged with other money, including town money and utility money. But that's situational, so we wouldn't know until we define the opportunities.
Deputy Mayor?
So if I'm to understand how this is laid out, is that year 1, year 2, year 3, you're only getting 200,000, and then the rest of the years you'll be getting that infrastructure funding, or I find that a bit.
Yeah, it's not really saying how much do you want each year, or they wouldn't give you the other 3 categories, right? The money would all be flowed over the 3 years, but they're looking at a breakdown to the next question here, right? Which is describe all known capital projects. So what is capital, what is operating?
Yeah.
That's really what they're trying to get at here.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
and
so-
they wouldn't include capital within those first 3 years, like that's not capital.
Excuse me.
It's not that it wouldn't flow within the first 3 years, it's just it wouldn't go on
They
those
wouldn't
lines.
go on
in
those
the
lines, okay.
application.
Yeah, that's it's a
Yeah.
little confusing, but I think what you're saying here is that the 200 grand is sort of the planning piece and it's spread over 3 years. But within that 3 years is also all the other money's going to get spent in a kind of an indeterminate schedule.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
at the end of 36 months, the money will be gone.
And I think it speaks to their idea to have periodic check-ins on these things. So like if the 200,000s are just assumed to be, that's gonna happen. And then it does happen, it will justify the flowing of the other money as we go, basically, yeah. It's an unusual, again, this is an unusual application structure.
But to your point, the 1.1 million for the co-op affordable housing piece is a matter of 5 minutes.
Yeah,
Isn't
yeah.
it? You sign a check.
And presumably, if in the first year we establish the structures for it, then they do, then if we've received initial approval, presuming that.
Yeah.
Then after the first year we establish the structures, then they give us that money and
Yeah.
we use it that way, yeah.
So what's the time frame for their decision? Do we know that?
Eric, what do we have?
They plan on giving the first installment of money in October, like September, October
Of this year?
of this year. So the application deadline is a week from today.
Yeah.
And that's why all of our
and so
timelines start
they
the first
have-
week of October.
They have a large number of people who are going to review these applications, and then we should hear back fairly quickly. Yeah.
There'll be thousands of applications. So my follow-up question is, I'm just trying to imagine if we have infrastructure repairs or plans or needs that aren't anticipated by this. I'm just trying to fit together our ordinary life as a council and a town that has infrastructure issues. How do we fit it together with this money? Should we obtain it? Should we be granted?
Yeah, well, I guess we'll know about this really quickly. And then the piece in this, which is the strategic infrastructure plan, will tie this into those existing plans. And
Or anything that might come up.
Yeah,
Unexpected.
and other funding sources.
Another
Like
funding
that's the other-
sources.
An example of that, if I may, is the I think more or less approved process of doing Main Street down to Cherry Lane. Could be added on to, for example, to bring a higher quality of water to Claremont Street to enable a 4-story apartment building on that property without the requirement for sprinklers, for example.
Yeah, well, I think that will be achieved regardless, but it's a good example to say, like, if there were adjacent to that, if there were a property, like we're already doing an improvement, and so the expansion could become added on to the improvement. And, one of the things we've talked about with that was included with that project is the line running up the hill to the top of the hill towards Blockhouse being
Right.
improved. And so, if there were an opportunity that size or only size to serve those existing properties. So if there were a knowledge that there were an opportunity to increase development within that piece, we would need to upgrade from the size we were planning to something bigger, then that upgrade could be built into the existing project utilizing funds flowing under this program. But the work would be done as a single contract. So even though it was, some of the money was from ICIP, but some of it could be coming from this. So the recommendation from the staff report, I'll bring it back to that because it's a good place to end it, was
Councillor Kerr.
Well, I'm just working up to making a motion
yeah.
that we direct, the council direct staff to submit the application as discussed today. Does that cover it?
Yeah, it's essentially what it says on the page.
Seconded,
Yeah.
thank you, sir. You've heard the motion
I have a question.
on the question.
So did we decide that we're happy with 100 permits? That we talked about that at the beginning of the meeting, that we would revisit that.
It was 82 was the incremental
82
as a result of the project.
I think to please Kelly, we said 101.
101?
Yeah, I find myself obviously in that situation when I say 98, but then that's still making it even because it's 80 plus the 18, so the incremental is 80. So if we want the incremental is 82. 82 seems pretty organic. Anyway, I don't know if it's right.
No,
You want to make me truly happy,
Uh-huh.
you could change the single unit housing from 15 to 20 and bring the total to 105. Which would bring them 82 to 87.
Yeah, I mean, is that I don't know, the motion is to, does everybody feel like that would be a good thing to do, or?
I'm
Make
happy.
it 105,
Yeah.
87 and
good with that.
18. Are you-
Okay, well, that's another one you gotta make a note, because that will
Councilor
flow through the
Carter's
whole thing in
seconders
terms of the
okay?
numbers.
Okay, so we're gonna amend the motion.
It will slightly increase the amount of money
amount of
that
money.
we're seeking, and then we'll just put
Okay.
that onto the infrastructure, because this is all, single family would be the infrastructure part.
So, and then the other piece that we had discussed earlier was the definition of affordable and whether we're just going to, whether we submit it as is or whether we change it, try to change it.
Yeah, well, I'm still recommending we go as is, and then we use the strategy development to define more in-depth targets, and then we work on that on our own within the definition that they've accepted, which is the higher level one.
Should that be included with the motion?
So the challenge with all that kind of thing is that this motion is a necessity to support the application, so
Right.
we don't really want it to have a bunch of other caveats that we then have to share.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Okay. Anything else on the question? All in favor? Motion's carried.
Councillor Olson happy.
And may I just say, this was done
Doesn't look any happier.
this was done in a bit of a rush, but it was a very, very good job.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Discussion.
Well, thanks to our new, still new, I think, deputy.
I'm calling
CEO.
myself new. Thank you.
I'm still calling myself new too.
I appreciate that. Thanks very much.
Yeah, well done.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to community logo development steering team draft minutes of July 31st. 2022.
Does Suzanne, do you mind,
Uh,
if this was at a council agenda, you'd be in the hot
Yeah.
seat to explain it, do you
Yes.
want to do that? Okay.
Well, if you had time to read over the minutes, we came to, we are asking that the town council accept the offer from the Mahone Bay Center Society with respect to the logo and agree to compensate up to $2,500 in cost incurred by the Mahone Bay Tourism and Chamber. So we passed that motion but we would like the town to agree with that. And there, just to add on, I received information last night about a possible funding opportunity that may also help the chamber with, if they apply under their tourism hat, rebranding and whatnot, financial grants. So we're going to pass that information. We figured they probably had it anyway, but I think people were in agreement that, you know, we should give some, but we decided a capped amount as was recommended to by councilors at our previous council meeting.
So the motion is to accept the offer of us taking control of the chamber's current logo and paying them a fee of not to exceed $2,500.
Yes.
Okay,
So moved.
seconder? Okay,
Question.
on the
In
question,
the process of. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious about the 2,500. Is that something that was discussed with the chamber, or is it something that as a committee you felt would be the right amount?
We decided, we did an estimate of what it might cost them, and we gave, we decided that I'm trying to recall that meeting, is that my hand notes that I
We
have.
discussed the things that could possibly need to be done on the chamber side,
Yeah.
and there was a good understanding from the members on the committee what that might entail, and that's where the 2,500.
Yes, and we decided, you know, it probably wouldn't cost them that much to replace all the stuff.
Yeah.
But we thought we'd put a cap at 2,500 on it, realizing that they're gonna bring up a list that's gonna say $2,500.
Yeah, basically, if we put
Yeah.
a cap, then probably
Yeah.
they'll use that.
They'll probably max out that cap, but
Yeah.
we
But-
wanted to stay within a certain parameter.
We didn't want them to bring in a bill of 10,000 or something like that, so we put a cap.
And I guess just for context, if this is obviously coming from the approved budget for the logo process, which at this point, I think that 2,500 will only bring us to $3,000 spent.
Mhm.
And then further in those minutes, there's an approval to go to RFP for just basically the refinement and updating of the existing logo once it's all under our control.
For our use,
That's
yeah.
assumed to be less than $5,000, so we're probably still talking about less than 10,
In
maximum
total.
of 25,000 established. So this is well within the established budget.
Just a comment about the wording in the motion, and this is in the interests of being having our motions be as specific as possible. Could we consider adding in the motion that the offer from NBTCC with respect to transferring the chamber's current logo to for the towns, allowing the town, or whatever the process
Yeah.
is, and agreeing to compensate? It's just so that anybody who's reading these minutes, you know, a month to a year, 10 years from now, won't have any idea what that means. So unless they go back, you know.
So who moved, and we got
Kelly,
Kelly and Richard, so
Richard.
friendly amendment.
are you two comfortable with just adding a little bit of specificity there? I think, and then Eric, have you captured that, or you and Kelly will watch the minutes and watch the recording?
I would be comfortable with changing to say with respect to the patriation of the MBE, blah, blah, whatever it is, logo to the town.
Yeah.
Yeah,
just
that's a
that.
simple way of doing it, yeah.
All right, you've heard the amending statement. On the question, all in favor? Motion's carried.
Oh, we didn't need too long.
Pardon me?
We didn't need too long for that.
Okay, that completes our agenda. How many folks do we have at home? Eric?
5.
Does anyone have any questions?
Nothing in the chat, no.
Okay. Well, with that, we will conclude the meeting. And we will entertain a motion to go in camera. Seconded by Councillor Carver, all in favor? Citizens at home who have chosen to spend some time with us today, we welcome your involvement and appreciate you taking the time to do so. And if you have any questions that come up later on about anything that was discussed this morning, you should contact Town Hall or contact me or the CAO or one of the councilors to have your questions